Hello, you are watching me, Mick, on my YouTube channel, Movies TV Mad. You can follow me on X at Movies TV Mad and on Instagram, Movies TV Mad X. Welcome to today's 30-minute video where we ask the question, is it possible that Warner Brothers are on the verge of bankruptcy? It is very, very possible. It's been possible for a very long time. Why do you think Time Warner sold them to AT&T in the first place? They were smart. They knew the time was coming. They, at the beginning, ran WB into the ground. Now, Time Warner definitely did a better job for all those years running WB better than AT&T, who didn't have a clue how to run a massive, film studio conglomerate. They didn't have a clue. They ran it into the ground. They launched HBO Max without a plan, without a Mandalorian type show, right? They were developing a Green Lantern Corps show. That could have been the big launch. They didn't have a launch then. That show was cancelled once Gunn and Safran became DC Studios. But they didn't have that Mandalorian. So they went to Zack Snyder. They knew the calls to release the Snyder Cut, and they gave him $70 million to do it. Now, originally, the better idea, which they were going to do, was that it was going to be a 4-part miniseries, the Snyder Cut, and they also wanted to greenlight a Justice League Series 2 and a Justice League Series 3, until Zack fell out with the people at Warner Brothers Pictures who didn't like him, who, the smart people who decided we needed a Justice League instead of a Zack Snyder Justice League. That was a really good idea. Not. Anyway, so once that happened, it was just a 4-hour movie. And, your mainstream, public audience, your normal general audience are not going to sit there for 4 hours. So a lot of people didn't even finish it, which is a shame. But it still got a lot of views and did well for HBO Max. Problem is, once people saw it, they unsubscribed to HBO Max. And, streaming just hasn't worked. In general, I think it's still working for Netflix generally, although they've taken a hit too. But the point is that Zaslav, John Stankey and AT&T went to Zaslav purposely to prepare for that moment when Warner Brothers could be sold. They've been cleaning house. That's what Zaslav's been doing. That's why there is a DC Studios, so the company can look more attractive to prospective buyers. That's what it's all about. But there's two scenarios here. Either Warner Brothers is sold to someone like Universal, who swallow it whole, and you never see the logo WB again, which is very, very sad. I grew up watching Looney Tunes, Superman the movie, Lethal Weapon, all these films, you had that stunning logo come up. And it's very, very sad what's happened. But Warner Brothers are not the only ones in this position. Disney are closing in on this position too. They're just not as near to WB. But, this is where Hollywood is. Really, Hollywood is on the verge of bankruptcy itself, because we keep on talking about them going to the mat with their own customer, their own consumer. And it hasn't worked out well. Their progressive politics, they're so driven with their politics, they're so ideologically kind of politically driven, and it's in their content now, it's in their artwork. And once you tell your customer, if you believe this, you're wrong, you're a jerk, and if you don't agree with us, then we don't want you watching our movies. What do you think is going to happen if you walk into your local supermarket and you say, wait a minute, who'd you vote for? Oh, get out, we don't want your type watching our movies. That's what they've said to straight white males. We don't want your type watching our movies. We hate you. This is how dumb and triggered these people have become. But there's many reasons why WB, is on the verge of bankruptcy. Will it become bankrupt? No, absolutely not. Look, it's not legal. They're not legally allowed to sell it off yet, either chunk by chunk or an entire concern, because the merger only happened about a year ago or whenever it happened, right? So they've got to wait to some point next year. But Warner Brothers will not go bankrupt, but it will be sold. That's always been the plan. That's why Zaslav came in, and there's no question about that. And as I say, it's a very sad realization for me, because I grew up watching, especially Looney Tunes. You know, every time you turned the telly on, there was a Looney Tunes cartoon. That's all, folks. And then the Warner Brothers, the WB symbol would come up. So, yeah, it's just a very sad situation that it's come to this. But it has, and it's going to happen. And the big question will be, you know, where does DC go? You know, does DC and Harry Potter and CNN go in the same place? Well, that will be if Universal can buy them, but then there'll be like a government. You know, the government will look at those assets and say, should Universal own Warner Brothers as well? I think it would be something that may not happen because of those reasons. But it's big business. Governments are corrupt. More than probably. I mean, if Disney were allowed to buy Fox, I'm sure Universal can buy Warner Brothers, although it is quite different because Warner Brothers is a huger studio than Fox was at that time. And this is why I think Disney got away with it. So there's a lot of kind of moving parts to whether or not Universal will successfully buy Warner Brothers. Now, and why are we talking about Universal? Because I think they're really the ones with the ambition to do it. And I think they're the ones with the money to do it as well. And it would make them the hugest, there's no question about that. They would be the biggest studio in Hollywood. And, you know, I'm sure Disney would be interested too. But I don't believe that Disney have the funds. Disney, as I say, are nearly as much trouble as Warner Brothers is as well. But this is why Zaslav was put in there, to make WB more attractive. That's why he's been pretending that everything in the garden is rosy and, you know, it's business as usual. And I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to give you Superman, Wonder Woman and Batman. And it's going to be so cool. Why do you think they were shelving movies like Batgirl? Why do you think a few weeks ago it was announced that they would shelve the Roadrunner versus Acme movie? Because they're desperate. Do you really think they want to shelve these films? Of course they don't. And the reasons they give that they're not good enough, that's just bullshit. They are desperate to raise money. We've been discussing this in terms of selling Snyderverse to Netflix. And I said to you the other day, Zaslav would sell his own granny if he could. He would lease out his own granny if he could. That's why, you know, this whole thing about DC content going to Netflix and going here and going there, it's because they're so desperate for the cash. This is a reality. This is real, people. This is not whispers. This is not gossip. Warner Brothers are in real trouble. And it's going to go. It's going to disappear. Either different people will buy different things, as we spoke about Harry Potter, DC, etc., or someone will swallow it whole. There is no question about that. I have no doubt in my mind. I really don't want to debate it with anyone because in my head, that's exactly what's going to happen. You know, Zaslav wasn't just brought over to turn around Warner Brothers and run it as their own company. Of course, they've denied that they want to sell it. But they're lying. Of course they are. They're not going to come out and admit that they want to sell the company because then maybe they'd have to admit that they're in financial dire straits. But there's no hiding that now. They are in financial dire straits. And selling this off to leasing this and that off to Netflix and them and that, it's not going to work. It is simply not going to work. The only way they get out of this, especially if you're on the verge of bankruptcy, there's only one way to deal with this situation. There's only one way to save the company before it goes bankrupt, and that's sale. Now, the problem is for Zaslav & Co, they can't sell Warner Brothers at its mass worth. Why not? Because the company's on the floor. And this is why there's a DC Studios all of a sudden. That's why they want to look like a good, successful company. Well, there's no way they can look like a good, successful company. I mean, Barbie, which, you know, they claim they made $1 billion with Barbie, is like one of their only $1 billion movies in many, many years. Since Joker. And then before Joker, I think it was Aquaman. And before that, they barely had $1 billion movie. So they weren't making money. They haven't made money for a very long time. You know, there's a reason why they sold the CW. People said, oh, they sold it because it never made money. Well, listen, the CW didn't turn over a huge profit. But it did okay for the old Time Warner. But the point is, they need money. So they're selling this off. They sold the CW off, right? Because they had to. They had no choice. That's what I'm saying to you. They are desperate people. So there's nothing they won't do. And if they can get away with leasing Snyderverse to Netflix or anyone else, they will. And this is why I said when we were speaking about the Snyder situation, it is not impossible. The conversations of Snyder being done or not are pointless. He's not done. He's never going to be done. So there. And this, I believe, eventually this will happen because they need it to happen. And the only way it don't happen is if they can wait to sell the company next year, then they won't need to do it. But as I say, they may sell everything bit by bit. It may not be just someone who swallows it whole. So that's going to be an interesting situation. I think to us, the most interesting situation is, I don't think I know, most interesting, important, vital decision is what happens to DC. I don't think I want to see a situation where this property, this character goes here and this character goes there. That's a mess. Not that one, entity owning DC has really done it much favours. But, you imagine Sony owning Superman, God forbid, Disney owning Batman and silly things like that. That would be something I wouldn't like to see. And so there is a reality that DC could independently be sold, right, and not be swallowed up by whoever buys WB. And I think that forget selling Snyderverse to Netflix. It could be a situation that Netflix fancy buying DC Comics, as we've discussed many, many times. Whatever you think is not probable, whatever you think is impossible. In years gone by, there's lots of things that would never have happened. The Snyder Cut would never have happened. Snyderverse going to Netflix would never have happened. But as we've already discussed, when you're desperate, you will do anything. James Gunn and Peter Safran have no say in what happens here. This is a corporate decision. They're not corporates. Yeah, they're CEOs of DC Studios, but they don't get to decide if DC gets sold to Netflix, if Zaslav leases out Snyderverse to Netflix. These are not things that Gunn, as much as he would like to, and like you to think that he has some say, he has no say. The only thing that he and Peter have a say on is this DC universe that they're developing. The end. I mean, just to break from this and come back to it again, I'm sure we will. There is a little bit of interesting things. James Gunn is being asked a lot of questions and he's answering them. And one fan asked him, why couldn't Robert Pattinson's Batman be part of DC Universe instead of introducing another Batman? And James Gunn said something very, very interesting. He said, because Matt Reeves doesn't want it. So we've got to respect that. So that's a curious answer, isn't it? It's almost like they asked him to allow Rob's Batman to join DC Universe, and he said no. Talk about asking a question you should already know the answer to. Because Matt was never going to allow that to happen. He'd never be involved with a DC Universe, cinematic universe. And I wouldn't want that either. That isn't, Rob's Batman, what Reeves is doing isn't for a mainstream cinematic universe. It's gritty more than dark. It's more realistic more than anything else, but it wouldn't fit in, It's a non-fantastical Batman. Like, in a lot of ways, Christopher Nolan's Batman was as well. And clearly, Gunn's already told us that this Batman will be more fantastical and this DC universe will be more fantasy-based more than anything else. So I just thought I'd bring that to you because it is very, very interesting. Gunn is talking a lot right now, interestingly enough. Asked about the suit. Something new or classic? All of the above, he said. So he doesn't want to answer about the suit because it can't be new and old at the same time. That would be a weird looking suit. For me, for once, I'd like to implement a suit accurately from the graphic novel, something. Because I think that would excite fans as well. Every time we get a Superman suit, mostly it's a brand new design. And I think maybe if you could take one of the popular designs from the comics, I think that would make people really, really happy. But we will see there. But going back to the Warner Brothers situation and them having a 60% chance of being, maybe going on the verge of bankruptcy, some of you may say, well, why is this public? Why would they want this to be public? Because if they do sell, they're going to need a justifiable reason why they've done it. And if they suddenly sell DC off to someone, the fans are going to ask why. Not that WB care, because once they're sold, they're sold. But they're going to need an explanation. But as I say, I don't think that they'll go bankrupt. I don't think that's a viable possibility, but they are in trouble. They are on the verge of it. But it's one thing to be on the verge of bankruptcy, as I'm using that word, and there's another, it's another thing altogether to actually go bankrupt. And that brings in you a lot of different problems because it would just be overly complicated to sit here and explain to you what that would mean. It would be very, very difficult if they were bankrupt. If they declared themselves bankrupt, I don't think they could really operate properly. There would be no Superman legacy. It would be near impossible. Not near impossible, it would be impossible, right? So I don't think that's going to happen anyway. So it'll be interesting by the time Superman Legacy is released in cinemas if WB is still their own studio with Discovery or they've been sold. Well, let me answer that for you now. When Superman Legacy is released in July 2025, Warner Brothers will be owned by someone else, or everything would have been sold off to different entities, and DC could be, owned by someone else. Now, here's the thing. If that's the case, the reality may even be that the people who buy DC Comics or own DC Comics, depending if they swallow it whole or everything's sold individually, may not want James Gunn's Superman Legacy. That would be another issue. So there's a lot of moving parts out there. I'd keep your ears open. I wouldn't think that basically right now we're in an ever-changing thing. Because as I say again, under normal circumstances, Superman Legacy would be safe. Gunn's DC Universe would be safe. But we're talking about a company in massive financial debt. And, this isn't make-believe. I don't want this to be a thing. I want Superman Legacy to happen, right? And I want it to be great, and I want it to be good, right? I don't want this to be a thing. This is not something I'm thinking, yeah, wouldn't that be good? Why? I'm a DC fan. I want to see these things, but I want them to be done properly. And I'm still cautiously optimistic on one side and skeptical of James Gunn on the other. That's where I am. I can wake up one day and go, yeah, I think he's going to cook. And then the next day I'll wake up on the other side of the bed and I'll think to myself, I am a little bit concerned. But we will see about that. But nothing is certain. Nothing is certain with Warner Brothers, because when you're in the financial trouble they are in, things changed. Things will change day by day. And whether they're filming it next year, whatever they are, right, in March or whatever, it doesn't mean you're ever going to see that film. They are in a very unsure foundations. They're on uncertain footing. There's no question about that. So yeah, they are in trouble and things are going to move. They're going to do whatever it takes. So if it means they sell DC, they'll sell DC. If it means they sell Harry Potter to Disney, actually that might be an interesting fit. I mean, look, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want Potter to go to Disney. I mean, look at what they've done to Star Wars and Marvel. But it'll be interesting. But, I think Warner Brothers are in this perilous situation where, as fans of DC as we are, or Potter, I'm a Looney Tunes fan, so I'd be quite interested where that would be going as well. Not that I think that's more important or interesting than what happens to DC. What happens to DC for me as a huge DC fan, and especially a Superman fan, and where Superman goes and where he lives and who creatively will be responsible for that is very important to me. But I want to reiterate this again. Warner Brothers are in big trouble. They will be sold or they'll sell things off in bits. I want to reiterate and repeat that so you understand. This is not me theorizing. This is not me doing one of those videos. If A happens, if B happens. I'm not predicting exactly what's going to happen, but things are going to move. Things are going to change, right? By July 2025, when Superman Legacy is supposed to be released, anything could happen. And you as fans need to be prepared for that. That's the only thing I can say to you, because we're not in certain times here. And as I say, I want Warner Brothers to exist on its own, making movies on its own. But this isn't the Warner Brothers that the brothers founded. It couldn't be more further than what that was. But then Disney isn't the Disney that Disney founded. A beautiful company making content for children. Moral lessons for children. Great escapism for children. It's become something else. Some people will call that progress. I call that devolution, not evolution. But really, we could name any studio and we could criticize them for the same things. So I think in the next year or so, it's going to be interesting what happens, especially with DC, because the whole Snyder situation is one of those things that's ran and ran and ran. We fought for the Snyder Cut, we got the Snyder Cut, and when we got the Snyder Cut, we made assumptions about the future. I did as well, but I genuinely believe that Snyder and AT&T and Stanky agreed to make the Snyder Cut into a 4-episode miniseries. Then they were going to do a Justice League Season 2 and Season 3 until he fell out with Warner Brothers. Then from that moment, it was a 4-hour movie because the studio just didn't care anymore. They didn't want. Look, the problem was you had that side of the studio, WB Pictures, who hated Snyder and didn't want it to be released because it proves how stupid they were to go from what Zack was doing to Justice League, right? It exposed them. So they desperately didn't want it to happen. This is a studio that's made mistake after mistake, whether it was under the leadership and tenure of Time Warner or AT&T or David Zaslav with Warner Brothers Discovery. It's been one bad decision after the other. And you don't just have to talk about DC, but predominantly DC is one of the most valued IPs. And they could have been really, really successful with it. But they weren't, because they made mistakes. If they were clever people, they would have known what handing Superman and Batman to Zack Snyder meant. As much as I love Man of Steel, I was watching it last night. Love it. But Snyder doesn't bend to no one. He's going to make his own movie and he don't give a shit if he only makes $1. But as a company, they need to make good shit and make money. That's the difference. So you have to care. And that is the problem they found themselves in with the DC Extended Universe. So it's a bit of a complicated thing with Snyder, because although I love him as a director, his films kind of can make a little bit of money, but not enough to kind of be competitive with other studios. And we mustn't forget that Warner Brothers is one of the hugest, most famous studios in the world. And as well as making great stuff and entertaining and art, it needs to make money as well. And that's been the problem with Warner Brothers for a very long time. They simply haven't made money because they've made schoolboy errors, especially with DC. And, we find ourselves, really, as the final curtain draws this year with Warner Brothers, it is going to be sad to see them sold to someone like Universal, or even worse, sold piece by piece. It's not really anything that anyone should be happy about and say, oh yeah, they had this coming. In a way, they have had this coming, but I don't get any joy. Warner Brothers is a long-running studio, one of the most famous Hollywood studios. And it's been involved with such classic television and films. And it's so tragic to see it like this. But there's no way back. I want to be clear about that. There's no way back for Warner Brothers. This year, nothing can happen legally. But next year, those wheels of selling it off as a whole entity or piece by piece will begin. Because that's when they're legally allowed to do it, since the day they merged with AT&T. Nothing's happened right now because legally it can't, but it will. Make no mistake about that. There's no point having a debate. There's no point with me arguing with anyone, because as far as I know, to my knowledge of how things work and the position that Warner Brothers finds itself in, there is no way back. That's what's been passed on to me, that there is no way back for Warner Brothers to turn this situation around. You got Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. That's surely not going to make money for them again. They've lost money on Shazam! Fury of the Gods, The Flash, Blue Beetle. And Aquaman is most probably going to lose money for them as well. I'd be very surprised, I would faint, if Aquaman and Lost Kingdom made $800 to $1 billion. I'd be absolutely stunned and surprised. So I don't see that happening. So this is the end of Warner Brothers being its own thing. And we can take, someone said this wouldn't have happened if they didn't do what they did to Snyder. No, that's just a kick in the ocean. As I say, they've been mismanaged for many, many years. In terms of the DC IP, they've had so many opportunities, so many plans to do things. One of the biggest mistakes was when they greenlit Batman Begins and Superman Returns and Green Lantern a few years after that. That was the opportunity to create a cinematic universe just before, pop in and do it before Disney did. And do it right. And bring in the right people. But they didn't do that. So, for example, Nolan didn't want his movie to be part of a cinematic universe. But at the end of the day, that was the time to do it, But then you could have launched the Ryan Reynolds' Green Lantern as the beginning of a cinematic universe. If they made a better Green Lantern movie, again, they missed the boat. And this has been Warner Brothers throughout the years. Warner Brothers, when Disney became successful with Marvel, had a decision to make. Do we remain an artistic studio that gives creatives and directors their artistic integrity, or do we start to, go become Disney? And I think the answer to that question should have been easy. If they remained a director-driven studio, they wouldn't be here, because that's how Warner Brothers always made their money, through 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, even the beginning of the noughties. That's what drove Warner Brothers to excellence. Just look at the Harry Potter franchise. Yes, it was a family, fun, cinematic universe, but it was done with such integrity. And Joe Rowling was allowed to work with good producers and good directors to bring something in. Then Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, again, a vision of a director, artistic integrity. They didn't interfere. That's why it worked. And there's been thousands and hundreds of great artistically driven films at Warner Brothers. HBO, for many, many years, has been making great shit. Nobody in Hollywood does, or at least did, what HBO used to do, and still does in a lot of quarters. So it's very, very sad, because if they stuck to being an artistically driven studio, they wouldn't be here now. They wouldn't be on the verge of bankruptcy. The decision to compete with Disney, the decision to try and make DC via Justice League, like the MCU, big mistake. But make no mistake, it was more than the mistakes made with the DCEU. You'd have to be very close-minded to think they're on the verge of bankruptcy because of that, or just that. They had the decision, as I say. They should have remained what the Warner Brothers originally wanted, an artistically driven studio. Because that's what Warner Brothers were famous for. I was listening to the commentary of the Lethal Weapon movies, Dick Donner, and how they allowed him to do what he wanted. And that's why that saga of films was so successful, because they trusted the creatives. And the only thing they ever said to Dick Donner, according to Dick Donner, anything we can do to help, we're here. That's what Warner Brothers used to be. But when you drive out titans of industry, this is what happens. And this is why Warner Brothers is on the verge of bankruptcy. And when Warner Brothers is sold, either in its entirety or piece by piece, for me, it will be a very, very sad day.